The Tears of God is an epic, polemical novel following Michael and Christina, later using several assumed names, as they travel through Muslim-majority societies to document the abuse of women and minorities. The central narrative focuses on their undercover conversion from Christianity to Islam and travel through Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Dubai, Lebanon, and Sudan, and their encounters with religious control, sexual exploitation, racism, persecution, and social hypocrisy. The book presents repeated critiques of Islamic law, women's treatment, child marriage, polygamy, female genital mutilation, jihad, anti-Semitism, and minority persecution, often through lengthy narration. A major theme is the suffering of Muslim women, Jews, Black people, Christians, converts, refugees, and domestic workers, especially in societies the novel portrays as governed by religious extremism, patriarchy, and social corruption. The work also contrasts the Middle East and parts of Africa with the United States, which the narrator presents as a symbol of freedom, human rights, religious liberty, and refuge. The main themes of The Tears of God include religious oppression and critique of Islam. The novel is strongly polemical and repeatedly presents Islam, Islamic law, and religious authorities as sources of injustice, hypocrisy, coercion, and violence. The suffering of women. A central theme is the abuse of girls and women through child marriage, forced marriage, polygamy, marital control, domestic violence, sexual exploitation, female genital mutilation, and restrictions on dress, travel, education, and independence. Identity, disguise, and survival. Michael/Christina repeatedly adopt new religious and cultural identities, Malik/Malaika, then Samir/Samira, to move through dangerous environments and gather testimony while trying to protect themselves. Freedom versus authoritarian control. The book contrasts Western ideals, especially American freedom, human rights, religious liberty, and individual dignity, with societies portrayed as governed by fear, religious authority, patriarchy, and social conformity. Minority persecution. The novel focuses not only on Muslim women but also on Jews, Christians, Black people, converts, migrant workers, refugees, and domestic servants, portraying them as vulnerable to discrimination, violence, and exploitation. Sexual hypocrisy and moral corruption. A recurring idea is that societies publicly claiming religious purity are, in the novel's view, full of hidden sexual abuse, prostitution, pornography, harassment, and exploitation. Anti-Semitism and Christian responsibility. Later sections emphasize Jewish suffering, criticize anti-Semitism among Muslims and Arab Christians, and argue that Christians should support Jews and Israel rather than adopt replacement theology or hatred. Nominal versus true faith. The novel distinguishes between people who inherit religion culturally and those who live by sincere moral conviction, especially in its critique of nominal Christians in the Middle East. Trauma as testimony. Much of the book is structured around first-hand observation, memory, and witness. The protagonist's journey becomes a mission to document suffering and expose what they believe the world ignores. America as refuge. The United States is portrayed idealistically as a place of safety, dignity, religious freedom, and human rights in contrast to the violence and repression described elsewhere. Here are the key characters in the novel The Tears of God. Michael Lewinsky/Malik Khan/Samir Ahmed, the American husband of Christina. He is protective, strategic, and central to the undercover research mission. He helps devise the plan to pose as Muslim converts, travel through Muslim-majority countries, and document abuses. Later, he becomes increasingly focused on Christian evangelism and defending Jewish identity and Israel. Christina Lewinsky / Aphrodite Krishna Khan / Malaika Khan / Samira Ahmed, the Indian wife and former Miss World figure at the center of the narrative. She has a traumatic past involving child marriage, abuse, exploitation, and religious conflict. Her experiences motivate the couple's mission to expose the suffering of women, especially in Muslim societies. She acts as the main observer of women's lives because she can enter female-only spaces. The Egyptian Imam, a Muslim Brotherhood-linked religious leader in the United States who oversees Michael and Christina's staged conversion to Islam. He gives them Muslim names, remarries them under Islamic law, instructs them in religious duties, and encourages their journey to Mecca and Egypt. Sheikh Faiz bin Ahmed, a wealthy Saudi businessman from Christina's past. He is portrayed as one of her earliest and most abusive husbands, connected to her childhood suffering and the novel's critique of child marriage and sexual exploitation. Mahmood Khan, a famous Bollywood film director and another abusive figure from Christina's past. Along with Sheikh Faiz, he represents the male exploitation Christina wants to expose through her writing. Rehana Khan, Christina's Muslim mother. She is associated with Christina's childhood trauma, especially the circumstances that led to Christina being taken to Saudi Arabia and exploited. The Imam's wife, a conservative religious woman who teaches Christina / Malaika how to behave as a good Muslim wife. She reinforces rules about dress, obedience, modesty, gender separation, and women's duties. The Lebanese Christian police officer, a senior anti-terrorism officer who saves Michael / Malik and Christina / Malaika from a Hezbollah kidnapping plot. He becomes a turning point in the Lebanon section, helping move the couple from Muslim West Beirut to Christian East Beirut. The Maronite Christian family in Lebanon, a nominal Christian household that hosts the couple. The family is used to explore what the novel sees as moral decline, nominal Christianity, and the contrast between inherited religion and sincere faith. Sakina, an elderly Sudanese widow who rents part of her home to the couple after they arrive in Western Sudan. She becomes part of the couple's access point into local domestic life, widowhood, poverty, and traditional customs. Sulwa, Sakina's widowed daughter-in-law. Her husband died fighting in Sudan's war and is celebrated as a martyr. Through her, the novel explores martyrdom, widows, poverty, and religious militarism. Khalid, Sulwa's deceased husband and Sakina's son. He is presented as a Sudanese soldier and martyr whose death is celebrated as entry into paradise, while the text strongly condemns his violence during jihad. Mona and Zara, Eritrean refugee girls hired by the couple in Sudan. Mona serves as interpreter and guide, while Zara works as a domestic helper. They help the couple understand local language, customs, and women's spaces. The three rival wives of the butcher, neighboring Sudanese women married to the same polygamous husband. They illustrate the novel's themes around polygamy, jealousy, domestic conflict, women's insecurity, and the effects of patriarchal marriage structures. Plot summary of The Tears of God. Christina and Michael, newly married and living in the United States, decide to author a book exposing the abuse of women in Muslim societies. But Michael persuades Christina to avoid writing only her personal story and instead gather first-hand evidence through undercover travel. To protect themselves and gain access, they stage a pseudo-conversion to Islam, taking the names Malik and Malaika Khan, learning Islamic rituals, and preparing to travel through Muslim-majority countries as supposed converts. Their journey begins in Saudi Arabia, where they perform the Hajj. The experience is portrayed as chaotic, dangerous, sexually threatening, and spiritually oppressive, convincing them that women's suffering is hidden beneath religious ritual. They continue to Egypt and Dubai, but instead of finding straightforward access to women's stories, they encounter hypocrisy, prostitution, gender exploitation, migrant worker abuse, and public sexual corruption, especially around Dubai's nightlife. In Lebanon, they are nearly kidnapped by Hezbollah-linked figures, rescued by a Christian police officer, and then move into Christian areas, where they become disillusioned by nominal Christianity, racism, anti-Black discrimination, and moral hypocrisy. Their mission temporarily shifts from documenting Muslim women's suffering to trying to preach Christianity to Middle Eastern Christians. But they eventually decide Arab Christian communities are too spiritually stagnant and return to their original research project. They adopt new names, Samir and Samira Ahmed, and travel to Sudan, choosing it as a place where they believe Islamic law, poverty, polygamy, female genital mutilation, jihad culture, and women's oppression can be observed more directly. In Sudan, they live among widows, refugee girls, and a neighboring polygamous family, documenting domestic life, widowhood, poverty, martyrdom ideology, rival wives, child exploitation, and the social effects of polygamy. The plot repeatedly uses the couple's travels as a framework for exposing what the novel presents as the suffering of Muslim women, Jews, Black people, Christians, converts, refugees, and domestic workers. By the visible portion of the document, the story has become less a conventional adventure plot and more a long ideological journey. The couple gathers testimony and observations meant to support a sweeping critique of Islamic societies, religious hypocrisy, anti-Semitism, racism, and gender oppression. The main conflicts in the Tears of God include Christina/Samira's trauma versus her desire to testify. She wants to expose the abuse she has suffered and witnessed, while Michael/Samir worries that telling the truth openly could put her life in danger. The couple versus religious authority. Their staged conversion brings them into conflict with imams, religious rules, gender restrictions, and expectations around dress, marriage, obedience, and ritual practice. Women versus patriarchal systems. A major conflict is between women's dignity and social/religious structures that the novel portrays as enabling child marriage, polygamy, domestic control, female genital mutilation, sexual exploitation, and forced dependence. Truth-seeking versus disguise and survival. Michael and Christina must hide behind false Muslim identities, Malik/Malaika, then Samir/Samira, to gain access to communities, but this creates constant danger, deception, and fear of exposure. The couple versus sexual violence and exploitation. Their travels repeatedly place them near sexual harassment, prostitution, trafficking, child abuse, and exploitation of migrant women and girls, which become central external conflicts. The couple versus extremist violence. In Lebanon, they face a kidnapping threat from Hezbollah-linked figures, and later the novel frames jihadist groups and martyrdom ideology as broader sources of violence and fear. Christian faith versus nominal Christianity. After moving through Lebanon and other Arab Christian settings, the couple becomes disillusioned by churches and Christian communities portrayed as racist, morally compromised, fearful, or spiritually inactive. Minorities versus discrimination. Jews, Black Africans, migrant workers, Christians, converts, refugees, and domestic servants are shown as vulnerable to persecution, racism, exclusion, or exploitation. America/freedom versus societies of control. The story repeatedly contrasts the United States as a place of liberty, rights, and safety with societies portrayed as restrictive, dangerous, corrupt, or hypocritical. Mission versus despair. The couple repeatedly considers abandoning their research after traumatic experiences, but each new injustice renews their determination to document suffering and expose what they see as hidden abuses. Examples of key conflict scenes in the Tears of God include Christina wants to publish her life story, but Michael fears retaliation. The opening conflict begins when Christina wants to expose her past abuse, while Michael warns that doing so directly could endanger her life. The staged conversion to Islam. Michael and Christina enter a mosque, take Muslim names, and submit to religious instruction, creating tension between their true identities and the roles they must perform for survival. The dispute over circumcision. The imam and community pressure the couple over circumcision, especially female genital mutilation, while Michael resists to protect Christina/Malaika. Malaika's conflict with Islamic gender rules. The imam's wife teaches her how to behave as a good Muslim wife, including rules about dress, obedience, perfume, travel, and marital duty, creating a major conflict between female autonomy and religious control. Sexual harassment during the Hajj. In Mecca and crowded pilgrimage spaces, Malaika experiences repeated harassment, while Malik tries unsuccessfully to shield her, intensifying the couple's sense of danger and disillusionment. The women pilgrims defending practices Malaika questions. Malaika interviews Muslim women about polygamy, child marriage, female genital mutilation, and wife beating, but many defend these practices as religiously justified. Dubai Square and the pursuit of Malaika. In Dubai, the couple encounters prostitution, exploitation, and aggressive harassment. Men follow Malaika and Malik back toward their hotel, creating one of the clearest physical threat scenes. The Hezbollah kidnapping plot in Lebanon. After settling in Muslim West Beirut, the couple is targeted for kidnapping by Hezbollah-linked figures and is rescued by a Lebanese Christian police officer. Conflict with nominal Christians in Lebanon. After moving to Christian East Beirut, the couple becomes disillusioned by the Maronite family's moral hypocrisy and by churches that appear racist, exclusionary, or spiritually hollow. The Church of the Black Slaves episode. Malik and Malaika encounter racial exclusion in Lebanese churches, especially when Malaika is mistaken for a domestic servant and redirected to a church for African and Asian migrant workers. The Beirut cinema scene. The couple enters a movie theater expecting an English film, but instead witnesses disturbing pornography and child exploitation, causing shock, rage, and a desire to abandon their mission. The debate over Arab Christians and Jews. Later chapters shift into ideological conflict as the couple criticizes replacement theology, anti-Semitism, and Arab-Christian hostility toward Jews and Israel. Choosing Sudan despite danger. After failed attempts in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Dubai, and Lebanon, the couple deliberately chooses Sudan because they believe it will expose more direct examples of Sharia, poverty, polygamy, jihad culture, and women's oppression. The Marriage of the Martyr celebration. In Sudan, Sakina and Silwa celebrate Khalid's death as martyrdom, while the narration condemns his violence and the ideology that glorifies violent death. The three rival wives of the butcher. The polygamous household next door becomes a living conflict scene, showing jealousy, insecurity, rivalry, child neglect, domestic fights, and the strain caused by sharing one husband. The female genital mutilation ceremony. One of the strongest conflict scenes occurs when Samira witnesses the circumcision of a 4-year-old girl and is horrified by the mother's insistence that it is religiously necessary. Describe in detail Malik and Malaika's undercover visits to Saudi Arabia, Dubai, Lebanon, and Egypt. Malik and Malaika's undercover journey is structured as a series of failed attempts to gather first-hand evidence about women's suffering in Muslim societies. Each country exposes them to a different kind of danger, hypocrisy, or disillusionment. Saudi Arabia. Purpose of visit. Malik and Malaika traveled to Saudi Arabia after their staged conversion to Islam, because the Egyptian imam insists they should first perform the Hajj before continuing to Egypt. Undercover identity. They enter as newly converted Muslims, using the names Malik and Malaika Khan and attempting to behave as observant Muslims. Main experience: their arrival at Jeddah and movement toward Mecca are portrayed as overwhelming, chaotic, and unsafe. The crowds are so dense that Malaika repeatedly feels physically violated and sexually harassed. Hajj rituals. The couple observes the Hajj not as a spiritual awakening, but as a frightening ordeal marked by heat, crowding, illness, fear, and what the narration describes as moral and spiritual darkness. Research attempt. Malaika interviews Muslim women about polygamy, child marriage, female genital mutilation, wife beating, divorce, custody, education, and women's rights. Most of the women she speaks with defend those practices as religiously justified. Outcome: Saudi Arabia gives the couple a traumatic introduction to their mission, but it does not give them the kind of direct access to domestic women's lives they hoped to document. Instead, it exposes Malaika to harassment and reinforces the couple's view that women are trapped by religious and social conditioning. Egypt. Purpose of visit: Egypt is recommended by the Imam as a supposedly devout Muslim country where the couple can meet pious people and help poor Muslims. Where they stay: Malik and Malaika spend about 2 weeks in a small hotel in Al-Adaba, downtown Cairo. Expectation versus reality. The Egyptian Imam had described Egypt as morally strict and religiously pure. Instead, the couple finds crowded tourist areas, nightlife, prostitution, alcohol, cabarets, belly dancing, and sexual commerce. Places visited. They visit tourist sites such as the pyramids, the Sphinx, Khan el-Khalili, and Al-Haram Street, but these places do not help them gather meaningful material about abused Muslim women. Narrative function. Egypt becomes a symbol of contradiction, officially Muslim and religiously proud, yet portrayed as socially hypocritical and morally compromised. Outcome: they leave Egypt disappointed because they cannot access the hidden domestic world of women's abuse. Their research stalls, pushing them to continue to another Arab country. Dubai. Purpose of visit. After Egypt, the couple chooses Dubai because they believe it may offer insight into a more modern, wealthy Arab society that claims to respect human rights and women's freedom. Initial lead. A hotel worker directs them to Dubai Square/Dawar Dubai, suggesting they will find women from all walks of life there. What they discover: the Dubai section focuses on prostitution, migrant exploitation, racism, domestic worker abuse, sexual commerce, and displaced women from war-torn or impoverished countries. Women's groups. The narration categorizes women at the square by nationality, race, religion, and perceived sexual value. It describes African, Arab, Asian, local, and halal temporary marriage prostitution groups. Malaika's danger. When Malik and Malaika visit the square, Malaika becomes the target of aggressive harassment. Men follow the couple back toward their hotel, treating her as sexually available despite Malik's presence. Malik's reaction. Malik becomes terrified that the crowd may assault Malaika and prepares himself to physically protect her if necessary. Outcome: Dubai convinces the couple that the public face of wealth and modernity conceals exploitation and sexual hypocrisy. They flee the country the next day. Lebanon. Purpose of visit. At Dubai Airport, a Lebanese Christian man persuades them to visit Lebanon, describing it as beautiful, freer, and home to a large Christian population. Arrival and first mistake. In Beirut, they choose to stay in Muslim West Beirut, specifically Hamra. They rent an apartment through a taxi driver connected to Hezbollah supporters and reveal too quickly that they are Americans and converts. Kidnapping threat. Hezbollah-linked figures become suspicious of them and plan to kidnap them, move them to southern Lebanon, and hand them over to Hamas. The threat arises because they are American, white/Western, and viewed as potential spies or unreliable converts. Rescue. A Lebanese Christian anti-terrorism police officer intercepts a phone conversation about the plot. He and his armed team remove Malik and Malaika from Hamra before the kidnapping can happen. Move to East Beirut. After the rescue, they relocate to Christian East Beirut, staying with a Maronite Christian family in Al-Mansouriya. New disillusionment. Instead of finding spiritual refuge, Malik and Malaika are disturbed by what they see as nominal Christianity, adultery, drunkenness, racism, and moral indifference within the host family and churches. Church racism. Malaika is mistaken for a domestic servant in a Lebanese church and redirected toward a church for African and Asian migrant workers, which the local society calls the Church of the Slaves. Cinema trauma. Seeking entertainment, the couple enters a Beirut cinema expecting an English film, but instead encounters disturbing pornography and child exploitation. This becomes one of the most shocking scenes in the Lebanon section. Outcome. Lebanon changes the direction of the story. The couple first faces Islamist violence, then becomes disillusioned with Arab Christian communities. Their mission temporarily shifts from researching Muslim women's suffering to preaching Christianity, before they later abandon that effort and return to their original research goal. Overall significance. Saudi Arabia exposes religious ritual, crowd danger, and women's internalized acceptance of oppressive customs. Egypt exposes the gap between religious claims and social reality. Dubai exposes sexual exploitation, migrant vulnerability, and public hypocrisy beneath wealth. Lebanon exposes both extremist violence and the couple's disappointment with nominal Christianity, racism, and moral compromise. Together, these visits show Malik and Malaika repeatedly trying to gather truth while hiding behind false identities, but each country forces them into a new confrontation with danger, gender oppression, racism, religious hypocrisy, or sexual exploitation. In summary, Malaika's experience of Hajj is not one of spiritual fulfillment, but of profound suffering, marked by physical hardship, sexual harassment, cultural disillusionment, and a near-fatal health crisis. The pilgrimage becomes a powerful symbol of the broader challenges she faces as a woman navigating a patriarchal and often hostile environment. Here's a detailed comparison of Zaina's bitter Hajj rituals experiences and Malaika's hardships during the Hajj rituals. 1. Zaina's Hajj experience. Zaina is a Western convert to Islam who describes her Hajj pilgrimage as the most horrific and immoral experience a Muslim woman can go through in her life. Her account is quoted in the novel as a first-hand testimony and is used to highlight the chaos, unsanitary conditions, and dangers faced by women during Hajj. Extreme overcrowding. Zaina describes the Grand Mosque as so packed that there was no place to perform the pilgrimage in peace. There was not even enough place to breathe fresh air. There was a sea of people, dirty public bathrooms, and toilets full of feces and urine, and on top of that, people slept in those places, ate food, and exposed their young to those unsanitary conditions. Lack of hygiene and safety. She is shocked by the filth, the lack of privacy, and the exposure of children to disease and danger. Aggressive behavior and stampedes. Zaina witnesses people being trampled to death during the tawaf, circling the Kaaba, with others jumping on their corpses without any sense of guilt. Sexual harassment. She describes being pressed and crushed in the crowd, feeling physically violated, and seeing men behave aggressively and selfishly. Emotional trauma. Zaina is left pale, shaking, nauseous, and dizzy, her dreams of a spiritual experience shattered by what she calls selfishness, extreme filth, extreme cruelty, aggressiveness, and insane behaviors. Summary judgment. She concludes that it is a violation of human rights to allow more than 2 million people, including young children, to gather together in the name of performing the religious ritual called Hajj, subject to death, looting, stealing, injury, and exposure to various forms of violence and many kinds of aggression. 2. Malaika's Hajj experience. Malaika, formerly Susan Peterson, undergoes the Hajj pilgrimage with her Saudi husband Mustafa and their children. Her experience is similarly harrowing, but the novel provides even more detail about the personal and physical suffering she endures. Extreme physical discomfort. Malaika and her children arrive during the peak of summer, with temperatures soaring to 48 to 55 degrees Celsius, 118 to 131 degrees Fahrenheit. She nearly faints from exhaustion and dehydration, and the crowded conditions make movement nearly impossible. Sexual harassment and violation. Malaika is repeatedly sexually harassed by male pilgrims in the crowded spaces of the airport and during the Hajj rituals. She experiences unwanted physical contact, including groping and even finding semen on her clothing after being pressed against strangers in the crowd. These incidents leave her feeling violated, helpless, and deeply traumatized. Lack of privacy and safety. The lack of gender segregation during the Hajj rituals exposes Malaika to further harassment. She is unable to protect herself or her children from the chaos and the predatory behavior of some men in the crowds. Even her husband is unable to shield her from the constant violations. Cultural and religious shock. Malaika is shocked by the reality of the pilgrimage, which starkly contrasts with the idealized version she had been taught. She witnesses and endures conditions that are unsanitary, dangerous, and dehumanizing, especially for women. The rituals themselves are depicted as chaotic and perilous, with frequent reports of injuries, stampedes, and even deaths among pilgrims. Health crisis. The physical and emotional toll of the pilgrimage leads to a severe health crisis for Malaika. She collapses from heat stroke and is hospitalized for weeks, suffering from a life-threatening illness that leaves her incapacitated and dependent on others for survival. Her husband is more concerned with completing the rituals than her well-being, further compounding her sense of abandonment and despair. Isolation and despair. Throughout the ordeal, Malaika feels isolated, unsupported, and trapped in a situation where her safety and dignity are constantly at risk. The experience deepens her sense of alienation from her husband and the society around her, reinforcing the novel's themes of gender-based oppression and the struggle for autonomy. Summary: Malaika's experience of Hajj is not one of spiritual fulfillment, but of profound suffering, marked by physical hardship, sexual harassment, cultural disillusionment, and a near-fatal health crisis. The pilgrimage becomes a powerful symbol of the broader challenges she faces as a woman navigating a patriarchal and often hostile environment. 3. Comparison table. Aspect. Zaina's experience. Malaika's experience. Physical hardship. Extreme overcrowding, unsanitary conditions. Extreme heat, exhaustion, dehydration, hospitalization. Sexual harassment. Pressed, crushed, physically violated in crowds. Groped, harassed, semen on clothing, repeated trauma. Emotional impact. Shock, nausea, emotional trauma, shattered dreams. Trauma, despair, sense of abandonment, isolation. Cultural disillusion. Disgust at filth, chaos, lack of humanity. Disillusionment with religious ideals versus reality. Health consequences. Nausea, dizziness, emotional breakdown. Heat stroke, severe illness, weeks in hospital. Support system. None. Feels alone and unsafe. Husband indifferent, family support absent. Summary judgment. Violation of human rights, calls for reform. Pilgrimage as symbol of oppression and suffering. 4. Conclusion. Both Zaina and Malaika's Hajj experiences are depicted as traumatic and dehumanizing, especially for women. While Zaina's account is an outsider's shocked testimony, Malaika's is a deeply personal narrative of physical, emotional, and psychological suffering. Both accounts serve to critique the realities of the Hajj pilgrimage as experienced by women, exposing issues of sexual harassment, lack of safety, and the failure of the ritual to provide the spiritual fulfillment it promises. The novel uses these parallel experiences to highlight the broader themes of gender oppression, cultural disillusionment, and the resilience required to survive in such environments. Here's a focused comparison of how the Hajj experiences affect the character development of Zaina and Malaika based on the content of the novel. Zaina's Hajj experience and character development. Zaina is presented as a Western convert to Islam whose testimony about Hajj is quoted in the novel. Her experience is one of profound shock, disillusionment, and emotional trauma. Disillusionment. Zaina's expectations of a spiritual, uplifting pilgrimage are shattered by the reality of filth, chaos, aggression, and danger. She is horrified by the lack of humanity and the suffering she witnesses, especially among women and children. Emotional impact. The experience leaves her pale, shaking, nauseous, and deeply disturbed. Her dreams of spiritual fulfillment are replaced by trauma and a sense of violation. Critical awareness. Rather than deepening her faith, the Hajj experience prompts Zaina to question the system and the treatment of women. She calls the event a violation of human rights and urges others not to look away from the suffering she witnessed. Transformation. Zaina's character is marked by a loss of innocence and a new, critical perspective. She moves from idealism to activism, using her voice to expose the realities of Hajj and advocate for change. Her experience becomes a catalyst for her to speak out, challenge injustice, and encourage others to do the same. Malaika's Hajj experience and character development. Malaika, formerly Susan Peterson, undergoes Hajj with her Saudi husband and children. Her experience is even more personal and transformative. Physical and emotional trauma. Malaika endures extreme heat, exhaustion, sexual harassment, and a near-fatal health crisis, heat stroke, and hospitalization. She feels isolated, unsupported, and violated, both physically and emotionally. Loss of agency. The ordeal reinforces her sense of powerlessness and deepens her alienation from her husband and the society around her. Her suffering is compounded by her husband's indifference to her well-being. Shattering of illusions. Like Zaina, Malaika's idealized vision of Hajj is destroyed. The pilgrimage, which she hoped would be spiritually meaningful, becomes a symbol of her oppression and the dangers faced by women in patriarchal societies. Catalyst for change. The trauma of Hajj is a turning point in Malaika's character arc. It intensifies her longing for freedom and safety for herself and her children. The experience strengthens her resolve to resist, seek escape, and ultimately fight for her children's future. Deepening empathy and activism. Malaika's suffering during Hajj is not just personal, it fuels her empathy for other women and her later activism. Her ordeal becomes part of her testimony as she transforms from a victim into a survivor and advocate for women's rights. Comparative table. Impact on character development. Aspect. Zaina. Malaika. Initial attitude. Hopeful, idealistic, seeking spiritual growth. Hopeful, seeking spiritual meaning and family unity. Experience. Shock, disgust, trauma, disillusionment. Trauma, illness, violation, abandonment. Emotional result. Disillusionment, anger, critical awareness. Despair, alienation, loss of agency. Transformation. Becomes a vocal critic, activist, truth teller. Becomes more determined, resilient, empathetic, and ultimately an advocate for women and children. Long-term impact. Uses her voice to challenge injustice. Uses her suffering as fuel for activism and escape. Her Hajj trauma is a key step in her journey from victim to survivor. Summary. Zaina's Hajj experience is a catalyst for her transformation from an idealistic convert to a critical, outspoken advocate. The trauma she endures leads her to activism and a commitment to exposing injustice. Malaika's Hajj experience is a pivotal moment in her journey from compliance and hope to resistance and advocacy. The suffering she endures deepens her empathy, strengthens her resolve, and becomes a foundational part of her later activism and fight for her children. Both women's character development is profoundly shaped by the trauma and disillusionment of Hajj, but while Zaina's transformation is outwardly critical and activist, Malaika's is more deeply personal, fueling her journey from victimhood to empowered survivor and advocate. Describe the kidnapping threat in Lebanon. In the Lebanon section, Malik and Malaika moved to Muslim West Beirut, specifically the Hamra area, while posing as Muslim converts. They reveal too quickly that they are Americans, which makes them suspicious in the eyes of local Hezbollah supporters. According to the plot, Hezbollah-linked leaders decide to kidnap the couple and move them south, intending to smuggle them across the Lebanese-Israeli border and hand them over to Hamas. The threat is framed as both political and religious. The couple's American identity, white/Western background, and supposed conversion make them targets for testing, suspicion, and coercion. The kidnapping is stopped when a Lebanese Christian senior anti-terrorism police officer intercepts a phone conversation about the plan. He and his armed team arrive at the couple's apartment, warn them, and quickly move them out of West Beirut before the plot can unfold. This scene becomes a major turning point. Malik and Malaika leave the Muslim-dominated area and relocate to Christian East Beirut, where the focus of the narrative shifts from Islamist danger to the couple's disillusionment with nominal, morally compromised, and racially prejudiced Arab Christian communities. Key findings from each country visit. Saudi Arabia. Malik and Malaika conclude that the Hajj is physically dangerous, chaotic, and unsafe for women. Malaika experiences repeated harassment, and her interviews with women suggest that many accept practices such as polygamy, child marriage, wife-beating, and female genital mutilation when framed as religious obligations. Egypt. They find a sharp contrast between the imam's idealized description of Egypt as pious and the reality they observe in Cairo's tourist districts, nightlife, prostitution, alcohol, cabarets, and social hypocrisy. They gather little direct evidence about private domestic abuse. Dubai/UAE. Dubai appears wealthy and modern on the surface, but the couple interprets Dawar Dubai as evidence of widespread sexual exploitation, migrant vulnerability, prostitution, racial hierarchy, domestic worker abuse, and harassment of women in public spaces. Lebanon. Their findings are split in two. In West Beirut, they encounter suspicion and a Hezbollah-linked kidnapping threat. In Christian East Beirut, they become disillusioned by nominal Christianity, racism against Black and Asian migrants, moral hypocrisy, and social segregation. Sudan. Sudan becomes the most useful field site for their research because they live inside local domestic spaces. They document poverty, widowhood, martyrdom ideology, jihad culture, polygamy, rival wives, child neglect, women's insecurity, and female genital mutilation. Overall, each visit deepens the couple's belief that women and minorities suffer under overlapping systems of religious authority, patriarchy, poverty, racism, sexual exploitation, and social hypocrisy, while also showing that their original research mission repeatedly shifts as they confront new forms of abuse and danger. Key findings from the Sudan visit. Sudan becomes the couple's most direct field site. Unlike Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Dubai, and Lebanon, Sudan gives Samir and Samira sustained access to everyday domestic life, especially through widows, wives, children, refugee girls, and women-only spaces. Poverty and hardship dominate daily life. In Western Sudan, they observe extreme heat, poor sanitation, unsafe housing, limited infrastructure, disease risks, lack of entertainment or communication, and households built from fragile grass huts. Women's lives are shaped by gender segregation. Homes are divided into male and female sections, and women's movement, work, social contact, sexuality, and public presence are tightly controlled by custom and religion. Widowhood is precarious. Sakina and Sulwa depend on limited resources after Khalid's death. Sulwa, as a young widow, is portrayed as socially vulnerable, economically constrained, and at risk of harassment. Martyrdom ideology is normalized. Khalid's death in jihad is celebrated as the marriage of the martyr, with his family believing he has entered paradise and been rewarded with heavenly brides, despite the narration condemning his violence. Polygamy creates household conflict. The neighboring butcher's 3 wives and 21 children become a central case study in rivalry, jealousy, insecurity, child neglect, domestic fighting, unequal attention, and emotional deprivation. Children are neglected inside large polygamous families. The children move freely between houses, eat wherever food is available, and are often caught in conflicts between rival mothers. Refugee girls are exploited, but also provide access. Mona and Zara, the Eritrean refugee helpers, become crucial to the couple's research as interpreter and domestic worker, while also illustrating how refugee girls are vulnerable to cheap labor, abuse, and sexual exploitation. Female beauty and marital worth are tied to the body. The narrative emphasizes local ideals around breasts, buttocks, fatness, body smoking, hair removal, and sexual desirability, especially in competition among rival wives. Female genital mutilation becomes the most shocking finding. Samira witnesses the circumcision of a 4-year-old girl and sees it as the clearest example of institutionalized harm against Muslim girls, justified by the mother and community as religiously necessary to preserve honor. Women themselves enforce harmful customs. The Sudan section repeatedly shows mothers, widows, neighbors, and midwives participating in practices that harm girls and women, largely because they believe those practices protect family honor and social respectability. Overall finding: Sudan confirms the couple's belief that women's suffering is embedded not only in formal law or public religion, but also in family structure, marriage customs, poverty, gender segregation, war culture, and inherited female traditions. The impact of polygamy on family dynamics. Polygamy creates rivalry instead of family unity. In the Sudan section, the butcher's 3 wives are described as constant competitors for the husband's attention, affection, sexual access, and resources. The household becomes divided into factions. Each wife sees the others as rivals, and even small children's quarrels quickly escalate into fights between mothers. Children suffer from neglect and confusion, with 21 children moving between the women's quarters and neighboring homes. The children lack stable attention and are often caught inside adult conflicts. Jealousy drives daily conflict. The wives compete over beauty, age, sexual desirability, and their children's perceived value, especially whether sons seem intelligent or daughters seem attractive. The husband remains emotionally distant. He works outside the home and avoids the women's disputes. When brought into conflict, his response is portrayed as punitive, including beating or withholding affection. Women's insecurity is intensified. Each wife fears being displaced by a newer, younger, or more attractive wife, making marriage feel unstable rather than protective. Female solidarity breaks down. Instead of supporting one another, the wives police, insult, retaliate against, and sometimes physically attack each other. Overall impact. The novel presents polygamy as a system that produces jealousy, emotional deprivation, domestic violence, child neglect, and a household built around competition rather than love or security. The impact of jihad culture. Jihad culture is shown as normalizing violence through religious reward. The novel portrays martyrdom as something celebrated rather than mourned, especially through Khalid's death and the marriage of the martyr ceremony. Families are emotionally conditioned to glorify death. Sakina and Sulwa rejoice publicly over Khalid's death because they believe he has entered paradise and been rewarded with heavenly brides. Women bear the aftermath. After the celebration ends, Sulwa and Sakina are left with poverty, widowhood, insecurity, and dependence, while the dead man is idealized as a holy hero. War becomes embedded in domestic life. The ideology of jihad is not treated as distant politics. It shapes household beliefs, children's expectations, widowhood, gender roles, and community rituals. Violence against outsiders is morally reframed. The narrative presents jihad culture as justifying brutality against non-Muslims and enemies, while shielding perpetrators from moral accountability by calling them martyrs. Overall impact. Jihad culture is depicted as turning death, war, and violence into sacred goals, while leaving women, families, and vulnerable communities to suffer the practical consequences. In the Sudan section, the household structure is built around gender separation, shared compounds, and extended neighborly access. Compounds are divided into male and female sections. The home is not a single unified indoor space, but a fenced compound of grass huts with separate areas for men and women. Samir and Samira rent the unused male section. Their rented space includes a large grass hut for sleeping, a small kitchen hut, and a toilet. Samira is allowed to stay with Samir there only because they are foreign guests and paying tenants. The women's section remains the social center. Sakina, the elderly widow, and Sulwa, her widowed daughter-in-law, occupy the female side. This is where women gather, talk, cook, host children, and manage daily domestic life. Samir is excluded from the women's world. As a man, he cannot enter the women's section, so he depends on Samira to observe, ask questions, and report what she learns. Samira moves between both worlds. Because of her role as Samir's wife and as a woman, she becomes the bridge between the male section and the female household spaces. 2 Eritrean refugee girls support the household. Mona works mainly as interpreter and guide, while Zara works as cook and domestic helper. Though hired by Samir and Samira, they also end up helping Sakina and Sulwa. Neighboring homes function almost like extensions of one another. The neighboring polygamous household is deeply entangled with Sakina's home. Children move freely between the 2 compounds, eat there, play there, and sometimes sleep there. The polygamous household is a 3-in-1 family. The butcher next door has 3 wives and 21 children. Each wife has her own place within the shared family structure, but the wives compete for authority, resources, attention, and status. Sakina acts as informal mediator. When disputes erupt among the rival wives, Sakina often serves as an arbitrator or elder woman who tries to restore peace. Overall, the Sudan household structure is communal but highly gendered. Men and women live in separated spaces. Women govern most domestic interactions. Children circulate between homes. And polygamy turns the extended household into a site of rivalry, negotiation, and constant emotional tension. The significance of the marriage of the martyr. The marriage of the martyr is significant because it shows how the Sudan section links war, religion, family grief, and social conditioning into one ritualized response to death. It transforms death into celebration. When Khalid dies fighting in Sudan's Jihad War, his mother Sakina and widow Sulwa do not mourn in the ordinary way. Their home becomes a kind of wedding hall, and neighbors congratulate them because Khalid is believed to have died as a martyr. It reflects the promise of heavenly reward. The marriage is not an earthly wedding. The bridegroom is Khalid, and his supposed brides are the heavenly virgins promised to martyrs. This belief allows the community to interpret violent death as spiritual victory rather than tragedy. It exposes the emotional cost to women. After the celebration ends, the practical consequences fall on Sakina and Sulwa. Khalid was the family's provider, so his death leaves them poor, vulnerable, dependent on a small pension, and socially insecure. It normalizes jihad culture inside domestic life. The scene shows that jihad is not presented only as battlefield ideology. It enters the home, reshapes mourning rituals, and teaches families to glorify martyrdom. It reveals the novel's critique of religious violence. The narration sharply contrasts the family's belief that Khalid is rewarded in paradise with its condemnation of his violence during war. This makes the scene one of the clearest examples of the book's argument that religious ideology can sanctify brutality. Overall significance: the marriage of the martyr functions as a symbolic turning point in the Sudan section. It shows how a culture can convert grief into public religious celebration while leaving women to endure poverty, widowhood, and the aftermath of war. Widowhood affects women in Sudan. In the Sudan section, widowhood leaves women socially vulnerable, economically dependent, and closely monitored. Loss of provider: when Khalid dies, his widow Sulwa and mother Sakina lose the family's main breadwinner and must survive on a small government pension and whatever income they can get, such as renting part of the house. Economic insecurity: because Sulwa is a young widow in a restrictive society, she cannot easily work outside the home without shame or danger. This leaves both women dependent on limited resources and later on the rent from Samir and Samira. Social vulnerability: a widow is portrayed as a marked target for harassment by unmarried men. The text suggests that widows and divorcees are treated as sexually available while not being considered respectable marriage prospects. Restricted movement: Sulwa's widowhood confines her more tightly to the women's section of the household. Going outside alone or seeking work could expose her to gossip, harassment, or disgrace. Dependence on older women: Sakina becomes both protector and gatekeeper for Sulwa, carefully deciding whether to rent the unused male section of the compound because she fears exposing Sulwa to male tenants. Emotional contradiction: Khalid's death is publicly celebrated as martyrdom, but after the marriage of the martyr celebration ends, the women are left with grief, poverty, and insecurity. Overall impact: widowhood in Sudan is depicted as stripping women of protection and income while increasing their exposure to social judgment, male harassment, and dependence on family or tenants. The experiences of Samira and Samir in their visit to Sudan about polygamy, female genital mutilation, child marriage, and the verdict of obedience against the disobedient Muslim wife Sulwa. In the Sudan section, Samir and Samira's experience becomes their most direct investigation of household life, women's suffering, and social customs. The main findings center on polygamy, female genital mutilation, child marriage, and wife obedience. Polygamy is shown through the butcher's household. Samir and Samira discover that their neighbor is a wealthy butcher with 3 wives and 21 children, forming what the narration calls a 3-in-1 family. The wives share one husband, but live in constant rivalry, competing for his attention, affection, sexual access, and resources. The rival wives' home is full of jealousy and conflict. Small quarrels between children often grow into fights between their mothers. The wives insult one another, pull hair, scratch faces, and compete over beauty, age, children's intelligence, daughters' attractiveness, and their husbands' favor. Children are emotionally and socially neglected. The children move freely between compounds, eat in neighbors' homes, and are often caught between the rival mothers' disputes. The novel presents polygamy as creating instability, confusion, insecurity, and poor emotional care for children. The husband's authority remains distant but feared. The butcher works outside the home and does not involve himself in daily disputes. The wives avoid bringing conflicts to him because they know his reaction may include beating, withholding affection, or refusing to sleep with them. Polygamy intensifies women's insecurity. Each wife fears being replaced or ignored if the husband marries a younger, prettier woman. The novel portrays this as a system that turns wives into rivals rather than companions and makes marriage feel like competition rather than protection. Samira observes the wives' beauty rituals as part of marital competition. The rival wives spend long hours removing body hair, smoking their bodies with sandalwood, and trying to appear sexually desirable. These rituals are presented as painful efforts to win or preserve the husband's attention. Female genital mutilation becomes the most traumatic Sudan scene. Samira is invited to attend the circumcision ceremony of a 4-year-old girl, the daughter of one of the rival wives. Samir asks her to witness it so they can document the practice, but Samira is horrified by what she sees. The mother defends FGM as religious and honorable. When Samira tries to persuade the mother not to proceed, the mother insists that circumcision is a religious obligation and necessary to preserve a girl's honor, virginity, and marriage prospects. The procedure is described as brutal and medically unsafe. The child is restrained by women, including her mother and neighbors, while an untrained traditional midwife performs the cutting with crude tools. Samira refuses to help hold the child and eventually faints from horror. FGM is presented as a system of female control enforced by women. The scene shows that mothers, widows, neighbors, and midwives all participate in the practice, believing they are protecting the girl's future honor. Even though the narration frames it as severe physical and psychological harm. Child marriage is connected to Sudan's broader treatment of girls. The narration repeatedly states that, in Sudan and similar societies, fathers can marry off daughters at very young ages, children can work early. And childhood is not protected in the way Samir and Samira expect from a Western human rights perspective. Khalid's childhood illustrates normalized child labor and militarization. Sakina's son Khalid begins working young to support his mother, joins Islamist activism as a child, and later becomes a soldier. This reinforces the novel's claim that childhood in Sudan is often sacrificed to poverty, religion, and war. The obedience theme appears through Sulwa's vulnerability as a widow and wife. Sulwa's life is defined by dependence on her husband's family, social restrictions, economic weakness, and expectations of female submission. After Khalid dies, she has little protection, limited independence, and few socially acceptable ways to support herself. The disobedient wife idea is linked to wife-beating and male authority. The Sudan section connects household discipline to the belief that a husband has authority over a wife and may punish disobedience. This logic appears in the rival wives' fear of the butcher and in the broader discussion of Quranic justification for beating a rebellious wife. Sulwa's situation shows how obedience traps women. As a young widow, she cannot easily work outside, remarry freely, or live independently without shame or danger. Her respectability depends on staying within accepted limits of female behavior, even when those limits leave her poor and powerless. Overall, Sudan becomes the couple's clearest evidence-gathering site. Unlike Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Dubai, and Lebanon, Sudan gives Samir and Samira access to daily domestic life. Through Sakina, Silwa, the rival wives, the refugee helpers Mona and Zara, and the circumcision scene, they conclude that women's suffering is embedded in family structure, religion, poverty, war culture, gender segregation, polygamy, child marriage, FGM, and enforced obedience. The couple's mission shifts several times as their experiences reshape what they think their central duty should be. Initial mission: protect Christina while exposing women's abuse. Christina wants to publish her own traumatic life story, but Michael fears direct retaliation. He redirects the plan into a broader undercover investigation of women's suffering in Muslim societies. Undercover research mission. They become Malik and Malaika Khan, posing as Muslim converts so they can enter Muslim communities, perform rituals, travel safely, and gather first-hand testimony about polygamy, child marriage, female genital mutilation, wife beating, and women's legal/social restrictions. Disillusionment after Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Dubai. Their early travels do not produce the direct domestic evidence they hoped for. Instead, they encounter harassment, tourism hypocrisy, prostitution, migrant exploitation, and public sexual corruption, which broadens their focus from women's abuse alone to wider social and religious hypocrisy. Lebanon shifts the mission toward Christian critique. After the Hezbollah kidnapping threat in West Beirut, they move to Christian East Beirut. There, they become disturbed by nominal Christianity, racism, moral compromise, and anti-Black exclusion, especially around the so-called Church of the Slaves. Temporary evangelistic mission. Malik decides that their higher calling is to preach the gospel to Arab Christians who, in the couple's view, have inherited Christianity culturally but lack true faith. Their mission temporarily becomes religious reform rather than women's rights documentation. Expansion into Jewish and theological themes. Their critique of Arab Christianity grows into a major argument about anti-Semitism, replacement theology, the treatment of Jews, and the need for Christians to support Israel and reject hatred of Jews. Return to the original research goal. After months of frustration, they conclude that preaching to Arab Christians is unproductive. They then abandon that evangelistic mission and return to their original purpose, documenting abuse of Muslim women. Final shift toward Sudan as the main field site. They rename themselves Samir and Samira Ahmed and travel to Sudan because they believe it will provide more direct access to domestic life, Sharia-influenced customs, polygamy, widowhood, jihad culture, child marriage, and female genital mutilation. Overall significance: the couple's mission evolves from personal testimony to undercover social research to religious evangelism and theological critique, and finally back to a more focused investigation of women's suffering in Sudanese Muslim domestic life. Their identities change as a practical disguise for each new mission phase. Michael and Christina Lewinsky, private survivors in America. At the beginning, they are simply a newly married American couple. Christina wants to publish her personal story of abuse, while Michael tries to protect her from danger. Malik and Malaika Khan, fake Muslim converts for undercover research. When they decide to investigate women's suffering in Muslim societies, they stage a conversion to Islam. Michael becomes Malik, Christina becomes Malaika, and they adopt the surname Khan to pass as newly converted Muslims. Malik and Malaika, pilgrims and observers in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Dubai. In these countries, they keep their Muslim identities so they can enter religious and social spaces, perform Hajj, interview women, and avoid being exposed as outsiders. Malik and Malaika, suspected American converts in Lebanon. In Muslim West Beirut, the same identity becomes dangerous. Because they reveal they are Americans, Hezbollah-linked figures treat them with suspicion, and their Muslim disguise no longer protects them. Michael/Christina beneath the disguise, Christians in East Beirut. After escaping the kidnapping threat and moving to Christian East Beirut, Malaika gives up the burqa and returns to Western clothing. Their Christian identity comes forward again as their mission shifts toward preaching to nominal Arab Christians. Samir and Samira Ahmed, new Arabiized identities for Sudan. After their Lebanon mission fails, they abandon the names Malik and Malaika because they sound awkward or suspicious in Arab settings. They choose Samir and Samira as more natural Arabic names, and Ahmed as a safer Muslim surname for Sudan. Overall, each name reflects a new tactical role. Michael/Christina are the real couple, Malik/Malaika Khan are their Muslim research disguise, and Samir/Samira Ahmed are their refined Sudan field identities for deeper access to Muslim domestic life. Their experiences in Sudan in brief. In Sudan, Samir and Samira settle in the western town of En-Nahid under their new Muslim identities, hoping to gather more direct evidence about women's lives than they could in earlier countries. They rent part of a poor widow's compound from Sakina and her daughter-in-law Sulwa, whose husband Khalid died in jihad and is celebrated as a martyr. Their stay exposes them to gender-segregated household life, poverty, widowhood, child labor, and war culture. Samira gains access to women's spaces through Sulwa, Sakina, and two Eritrean refugee helpers, Mona and Zara, while Samir mostly records what she reports. The most important experiences involve a neighboring polygamous butcher with 3 wives and 21 children. Through that family, they observe rivalry between wives, jealousy, neglected children, domestic quarrels, wife-beating, and women's constant effort to secure their husband's attention. Their most traumatic Sudan experience is witnessing female genital mutilation performed on a 4-year-old girl. Samira is horrified by the mother's insistence that circumcision is religiously necessary and by the brutal procedure itself, which becomes one of the strongest examples of the novel's critique of harm against girls. Overall, Sudan becomes their clearest field site. It shows them everyday domestic oppression through polygamy, widowhood, jihad ideology, poverty, gender segregation, child marriage, wife obedience, and female genital mutilation. Sudan Visit Highlights. The Sudan visit is a major turning point because it gives Samir and Samira the clearest access to everyday domestic life and the abuse they were trying to document. New identities and setting. They abandon the names Malik and Malaika and become Samir and Samira Ahmed, then travel to Sudan, choosing it because it is portrayed as a place where Sharia, poverty, jihad culture, polygamy, and women's oppression can be observed directly. Move from Khartoum to En-Nahid. They briefly stay in wealthy Khartoum, but decide the capital hides the realities they want to study. They relocate to En-Nahid in western Sudan, where life is poor, hot, isolated, and physically difficult. Life in a widow's compound. They rent part of a grass hut compound from Sakina, an elderly widow, and Sulwa, her widowed daughter-in-law. The compound is divided into male and female sections, giving Samira access to women's spaces, while Samir mostly records her observations. Marriage of the martyr. Sulwa's dead husband Khalid is celebrated as a jihad martyr. His death is treated like a wedding to heavenly virgins, but the women he leaves behind face poverty, widowhood, and insecurity. Polygamous neighbor household. The neighboring butcher has 3 wives and 21 children. Through this family, the couple observes jealousy, rivalry, neglected children, domestic conflict, wife-beating, and competition among wives for beauty, sex, and status. Eritrean refugee helpers. They hire Mona as interpreter and Zara as domestic helper. These girls help the couple understand local life while also showing how refugee girls are vulnerable to exploitation. Female genital mutilation. The most traumatic event is Samira witnessing the circumcision of a 4-year-old girl. The ceremony is presented as religiously justified by the mother, but Samira experiences it as brutal, medically unsafe, and devastating. Child marriage and child labor. The Sudan section repeatedly portrays childhood as unprotected, with girls vulnerable to early marriage and children expected to work or even become soldiers. Female obedience and vulnerability. The visit emphasizes that women are expected to submit to male authority. Sulwa's widowhood shows how a woman without a husband becomes economically weak, socially exposed, and dependent on others. Overall highlight: Sudan becomes the couple's most important research site because it reveals oppression not only through public religion or law, but through household structure, marriage customs, poverty, war ideology, gender segregation, and women themselves enforcing harmful traditions. Samira's first-hand witness of female genital mutilation, FGM in Sudan. Samira's first-hand witness of FGM in Sudan is presented as the most traumatic event of the Sudan section. Invitation to the ceremony. One of the butcher's rival wives proudly invites Samira to attend the circumcision celebration of her 4-year-old daughter. The mother treats it as a happy, honorable family occasion, while Samira immediately understands it as a serious act of harm. Failed attempt to stop it. Samira tries to persuade the mother not to go ahead, warning that the procedure will hurt the child. The mother rejects this and argues that circumcision is a religious duty necessary to preserve a girl's honor, virginity, and future marriage prospects. Samir asks her to witness it. Samir urges Samira to attend so they can document the practice directly for their research. Samira agrees, but she later deeply regrets witnessing it. The child is restrained. On the day of the ceremony, the little girl is taken into a dark room. Her hands and legs are tied, and when she begins to resist, her mother calls Sakina and Sulwa to help hold her down. Samira refuses to assist. The mother asks Samira to help restrain the girl, but Samira refuses. Instead, she is horrified by the way the women cooperate in the procedure while seeing it as necessary and proper. The procedure is brutal and primitive. An illiterate traditional midwife/circumciser performs the operation with crude tools, without medical training, anesthesia, or hygienic safeguards. Samira watches the child scream, bleed, and struggle while the women continue. Samira faints from horror. The scene becomes unbearable for her. Before the procedure is complete, Samira loses consciousness and collapses on the floor. Lasting impact on Samira. Afterward, Samira is haunted by the memory. The experience becomes one of the clearest and most disturbing examples in the novel of how girls' bodies are controlled through custom, religion, family honor, and women themselves enforcing harmful traditions. Narrative significance. The scene confirms for Samir and Samira that Sudan offers the direct domestic evidence they had been seeking. It turns FGM from an abstract issue discussed in interviews into a witnessed act of physical and psychological violence against a child. Samir and Samira document the FGM practice mainly through direct observation, interviews, and written notes. Samira gains access because she is a woman. In Sudan, Samir cannot enter the women's section of the household, so Samira becomes the main eyewitness inside women-only spaces. They first gather background through conversation. Samira talks with the mother of the little girl and hears her religious and social justification for circumcision, including the belief that it protects a girl's honor, virginity, and marriage prospects. Samira attempts to prevent it. Before the ceremony, she tries to persuade the mother that the procedure will harm the child, but the mother rejects her objections and insists it is a necessary religious duty. Samir asks Samira to witness it firsthand. Because their research depends on eyewitness evidence, Samir urges her to attend the ceremony and report what she sees, even though the subject is deeply disturbing. Samira attends the ceremony as an observer. She watches the little girl being restrained by women, the midwife/circumciser preparing crude tools, and the procedure being carried out in a domestic setting rather than a medical environment. She refuses to participate. When asked to help hold the child down, Samira refuses, which marks her role as a witness rather than an accomplice. The experience overwhelms her. She becomes physically and emotionally unable to endure the scene and faints before it is fully completed. Afterward, she reports the details to Samir. Samir records her account on his laptop as part of their growing research database on women's lives in Nahid. Overall, their documentation combines women's testimony, Samira's eyewitness account, and Samir's written records, turning FGM from a topic they had only heard discussed into one of the strongest first-hand examples in their Sudan fieldwork. The novel presents women as the main enforcers of FGM, not just passive victims of it. Mothers treat FGM as a duty of protection. The mother of the 4-year-old girl believes circumcision is necessary to preserve her daughter's honor, virginity, and future marriageability. Women justify the practice religiously and socially. The mother explains FGM as a required obligation and supports it with religious arguments, showing how tradition is reinforced through belief. Female elders and neighbors participate. When the child resists, women such as Sakina and Sulwa help restrain her, turning the procedure into a collective female act rather than only a family decision. The midwife/circumciser holds ritual authority. The woman performing the procedure is not medically trained, but she is socially trusted because the role has been inherited through generations of women. FGM becomes a public celebration. The event is framed by the community as a happy occasion, which normalizes the harm and turns bodily control into a rite of passage. Women police other women's respectability. In this social world, an uncircumcised girl is associated with shame, sexual danger, and dishonor, so women help enforce the practice to protect family reputation. Samira's horror exposes the contradiction. She sees that the same women who love the child also participate in harming her, because they believe the harm is necessary for social survival. Overall, the novel portrays FGM in Sudan as a system maintained by women through motherhood, unneighborly pressure, inherited custom, religious belief, and fear of dishonor, even though girls and women are its direct victims. The social consequences of FGM in the novel are portrayed as severe and far-reaching. It controls girls' sexuality. FGM is presented as a way to prevent girls from having premarital sex, masturbation, or sexual independence. It becomes tied to family honor. A circumcised girl is treated as respectable and marriageable, while an uncircumcised girl risks being viewed as shameful or dishonorable. It reinforces women's dependence on marriage. Because social worth is linked to virginity and future marriage, girls' bodies are controlled to preserve their perceived value to husbands and families. It creates fear around female desire. The practice reflects a belief that female sexuality is dangerous unless physically restrained and socially monitored. It gives older women power over younger girls. Mothers, neighbors, widows, and traditional midwives enforce the custom, making women both victims and agents of the system. It normalizes violence as a rite of passage. The procedure is treated as a celebration rather than abuse, which makes the harm socially acceptable and harder to challenge. It produces lifelong stigma. An uncircumcised woman is insulted, marginalized, or seen as morally suspect, while circumcision becomes a marker of religious and social belonging. It damages intimacy and marriage. The novel depicts FGM as making sex painful or traumatic, turning marriage into another site of suffering rather than security. It silences dissent. Samira's objections are dismissed because the mother and community believe religious duty and social honor matter more than the child's pain. Overall, FGM is shown as a social system that protects reputation at the cost of girls' bodies, autonomy, health, and future emotional life. The child marriage in Sudan. In the Sudan section, child marriage is presented as part of a wider system that denies children protected childhood. Girls can be married very young. The narration states that, in Sudan, a father may give his daughter in marriage at around 10 years old, treating marriage as a parental right rather than the child's choice. Childhood is shortened by adult obligations. The book links child marriage with child labor and child soldiering, arguing that children are expected to work, marry, or fight long before they are emotionally or physically mature. Girls' value is tied to marriageability. A girl's future is presented as depending on virginity, circumcision, obedience, and family honor, not education or personal freedom. FGM and child marriage reinforce each other. Female genital mutilation is portrayed as preparing girls for marriage by controlling sexuality and preserving perceived honor, making early marriage socially easier to justify. Poverty strengthens the practice. In poor households, marrying off a daughter can be treated as a way to reduce economic burden or secure family status. Male authority dominates the decision. Fathers and male guardians are shown as having decisive control over girls' futures, while girls themselves have little or no say. Overall, the Sudan visit portrays child marriage as one expression of a broader patriarchal system where girls' bodies, sexuality, labor, and futures are controlled by family, custom, and religious justification. Sulwa's obedience conflict. Sulwa's obedience conflict is mainly about how widowhood and religious/social expectations leave her with very little freedom. She is expected to remain submissive and respectable. After Khalid's death, Sulwa must behave as a modest, obedient widow under Sakina's protection. Any independence could expose her to gossip or disgrace. Work outside the home is treated as shameful and dangerous. Because she is young and widowed, seeking employment in a male-dominated society would make her vulnerable to harassment and social judgment. Her dependence is enforced by custom. With no husband, no children, and limited money, Sulwa depends on Sakina, the government pension, and later the rent from Samir and Samira. Male authority is still central even after the husband's death. Khalid is celebrated as a martyr, but Sulwa is left with the practical suffering, poverty, isolation, and insecurity. The disobedient wife idea appears through the wider culture. The Sudan section connects female obedience to the belief that husbands may punish rebellious wives, especially through the example of the butcher's wives, who fear beatings and loss of affection if they involve him in disputes. Overall, Sulwa's conflict is not open rebellion but trapped obedience. She must preserve honor, avoid shame, and survive within rules that give her little economic, social, or personal independence. Sulwa's social challenges are shaped by widowhood, poverty, gender expectations, and social vulnerability. Economic dependence. After Khalid's death, Sulwa loses the family provider and must rely on Sakina, a small pension, and later rent from Samir and Samira. Restricted independence. As a young widow, she cannot easily work outside the home without risking gossip, shame, or harassment. Sexual vulnerability. The narrative presents widows as targets for unmarried men, who may harass them but not necessarily respect them as marriage prospects. Dependence on Sakina's protection. Sulwa remains under her mother-in-law's supervision because living alone or moving freely would expose her to social danger. Limited remarriage options. Her status as a widow makes her socially less desirable, and remarriage could mean entering an unequal or polygamous household. Pressure to preserve respectability. Sulwa must behave modestly and obediently to avoid damaging her honor or Sakina's household reputation. Burden of martyrdom culture. Khalid is celebrated as a martyr, but Sulwa is left to endure the practical consequences: poverty, loneliness, and insecurity. Overall, Sulwa's life shows how widowhood can trap a woman between honor, dependence, poverty, and the threat of social judgment. The child marriage of the butcher's daughter to the elderly Hajj Harun is presented as another example of how girls are treated as family assets rather than protected children. Loss of childhood. The girl is pushed from childhood directly into adult marriage before she has the maturity, freedom, or power to understand or refuse what is happening. Transfer of control from father to husband. Her father's authority over her is replaced by Hajj Harun's authority, meaning she moves from one male-controlled household into another. Age imbalance and vulnerability. Because Hajj Harun is an old man, the marriage creates a severe power imbalance. The girl has almost no ability to negotiate, resist, or protect herself. Social approval of abuse. The marriage is treated by the surrounding culture as acceptable because it is sanctioned by custom, religion, and parental authority, even though the narrative frames it as exploitation. Emotional and physical harm. The girl is likely to experience fear, isolation, sexual trauma, and the burdens of adult wifehood while still a child. Education and independence are cut off. Marriage forecloses any chance of schooling, personal development, or independent future. Her value becomes tied to obedience, fertility, and household service. Reinforcement of polygamous patriarchy. The marriage shows how older men can use wealth and status to acquire young wives, while daughters become bargaining tools inside the marriage system. Impact on the mother and rival wives. The event also intensifies the household's gender conflict. Women may resent, envy, or compete around the marriage because daughters' beauty and marriageability affect each wife's status. Overall, the marriage to Hajj Harun represents the novel's critique of child marriage as a system that sacrifices girls' bodies, education, safety, and childhood to male authority, family honor, and social custom. Child marriage affects the family in several damaging ways in the Sudan section. It turns daughters into family assets. A girl's marriage becomes a way for the family to gain status, money, alliances, or relief from economic burden rather than a choice made for the child's well-being. It reinforces male authority. The father or male guardian controls the girl's future, and the girl is transferred from obedience to her father into obedience to an older husband. It raises the mother's status, or rivalry. In a polygamous household, a daughter's beauty and marriageability can increase her mother's position, but it can also intensify jealousy among rival wives. It creates competition between mothers. Wives compare their daughters' attractiveness and marriage prospects, turning children into symbols of each wife's worth. It removes the girl from childhood. The daughter is expected to become a wife before she is emotionally, physically, or socially ready, cutting off normal development, schooling, and independence. It normalizes harm for younger siblings. When one child is married off young, the practice becomes accepted as normal for other girls in the household. It deepens family inequality. Sons are valued for intelligence, work, and public opportunity, while daughters are valued mainly for virginity, obedience, beauty, and marriageability. Overall, child marriage damages the family by making girls instruments of honor, status, and exchange, while strengthening patriarchy, rivalry among women, and the loss of childhood. The polygamist husband. The butcher is compelled by the Sharia court to allow another man to sleep with his divorced wife because the court treats the situation as a matter of religious marriage law, not personal dignity or household privacy. The butcher has divorced one of his wives in a way that makes reconciliation legally complicated. Under the rule being applied, he cannot simply take her back after that divorce. For her to become lawful to him again, she must first marry another man, and that marriage must be physically consummated. Hajj Harun, an elderly man, becomes the required intervening husband. The court therefore forces the butcher to allow Hajj Harun to sleep with the divorced wife, even inside the butcher's own house, because that act is treated as the necessary legal condition before the butcher can remarry or reclaim her. The scene humiliates the butcher because another man is given lawful sexual access to a woman who had been his wife. It also exposes the wife's lack of agency. Her body becomes the object through which male divorce rules, court authority, and religious legality are resolved. Overall, the episode is used to criticize a system in which marriage, divorce, obedience, and women's sexuality are controlled by male authority and court-enforced religious procedure. The Sharia court functions as the formal authority that turns private marriage problems into legally enforceable religious rulings. It decides who is lawful to whom. The court determines whether a divorced couple may reunite, whether a marriage is valid, and under what conditions a woman can return to a former husband. It enforces divorce consequences. When a husband divorces a wife in a way that makes immediate reconciliation forbidden, the court applies the rule that she must first marry another man and consummate that marriage before she can return to her former husband. It prioritizes religious procedure over personal dignity. In the butcher's dispute, the court's logic is not based on emotional harm, privacy, or the wife's wishes, but on satisfying the legal religious condition required to make remarriage permissible. It reinforces male-controlled marriage structures. The wife becomes the object through which male divorce, remarriage, and household authority are resolved, while her own agency is minimized. It humiliates the husband while controlling the wife. The butcher is forced to accept Hajj Harun's lawful access to the divorced wife, showing that even the husband's pride is subordinate to the court's interpretation of Sharia procedure. It legitimizes community enforcement. Once the court gives its ruling, the matter is no longer just a family conflict. It becomes a socially and religiously sanctioned command that the parties must obey. Overall, the Sharia court is portrayed as a system that formalizes patriarchal control over marriage, divorce, obedience, sexuality, and reconciliation, often at the expense of women's dignity and personal choice. In the Sudan, divorce is portrayed as leaving women with loss of status, weak legal power, and social exposure. A divorced woman is treated as used or secondhand. The narrative repeatedly frames divorce as damaging a woman's reputation and marriage prospects, especially in conservative communities where virginity and obedience define female respectability. She loses security and protection. Marriage is presented as a woman's main source of housing, status, food, and social protection. Once divorced, she becomes vulnerable to poverty, harassment, and dependence on relatives. Her choices narrow sharply. A divorced woman may struggle to remarry except as a lower-status wife, an older man's wife, or part of a polygamous household. Divorce reinforces male authority. The husband can initiate divorce far more easily than the wife, while the woman's future remains subject to family pressure, court rulings, and community judgment. The Sharia court controls reconciliation. In the butcher's divorce dispute, the court applies religious procedure to decide whether the divorced wife can return to him, turning her body and marital status into matters governed by male authority and legal ritual. Custody and family belonging become unstable. The document elsewhere emphasizes that after divorce, women may lose control over children or household position, increasing their dependence on male relatives or in-laws. Social shame discourages resistance. Women may remain in unhappy or abusive marriages because divorce can bring disgrace to them and their families. Overall, divorce in Sudan is depicted as a social and legal trap for women. It may free them from a husband, but it often leaves them poor, less respected, more vulnerable, and still controlled by family, court, and custom. In the Sudan, divorced women cope mainly by trying to preserve survival, respectability, and protection in a society that treats divorce as a serious social disadvantage. Returning to family protection, a divorced woman often depends on parents, in-laws, or older female relatives because living alone can expose her to gossip, harassment, or economic danger. Avoiding public shame, she must behave carefully and modestly to protect her reputation because divorce marks her as socially vulnerable and less respectable than an unmarried virgin. Accepting limited remarriage options, divorce may force a woman to consider marriage to an older man, a widower, or a polygamist, not necessarily for love, but for protection, housing, and social legitimacy. Enduring dependence rather than independence. Because work outside the home is portrayed as risky or shameful, divorced women may remain financially dependent instead of pursuing open economic freedom. Escaping through migration when possible. The Dubai-related Sudanese divorcee's story shows one rare coping strategy. She uses immigration to the West as a way to escape an abusive husband and gain legal protection she could not rely on in the Arab setting. Risking social collapse if they run away. The novel portrays runaway divorced or abused women as having few safe shelters. Without family support, they may fall into street life, exploitation, or prostitution. Suppressing complaints to avoid worse consequences. Many women remain silent about abuse or neglect because a second divorce, public scandal, or family disgrace could make their situation even harder. Overall, the novel presents divorced women's coping strategies as constrained and defensive. They survive through family shelter, modest behavior, remarriage, migration if available, or silence, but rarely through true independence. The tale of Ajoba is presented as a legendary account explaining the fall of Soba, the old Christian capital of the Nubian/Alwa kingdom near present-day Khartoum. Ajoba is portrayed as a woman whose revenge destroys a city. In the legend, Ajoba is wronged by the people or rulers of Soba, and her personal grievance becomes the spark for the city's ruin. She uses deception rather than military power. Instead of defeating Soba directly, Ajoba is described as manipulating enemies or outsiders into attacking it, showing how internal betrayal can be more destructive than open war. Soba becomes a symbol of lost Christian civilization. The destroyed city represents the end of an older Christian Sudanese world and the replacement of that world by later Arab Islamic dominance. The author refers to the tale to explain Sudan's historical transformation. By invoking Ajoba, the author connects the couple's Sudan visit to a broader story of how Christian Nubia/Sudan supposedly collapsed through betrayal, invasion, and social weakness. It also mirrors the book's recurring theme of women's power under oppression. Ajoba is a woman in a patriarchal world, but the legend gives her destructive agency. Her suffering or humiliation becomes historically consequential. Overall significance. The author uses Ajoba's legend as a symbolic bridge between ancient Sudan's Christian past and the present Sudan that Samir and Samira encounter, poor, Islamized, patriarchal, and marked by the collapse of earlier social and religious orders. How Ajoba's tale relates to women's power and also misogyny. Ajoba's tale relates to both women's power and misogyny because the legend gives a woman enormous historical force while also framing that force as dangerous and destructive. Women's power. Ajoba is remembered as a woman whose actions allegedly bring down Soba, the old Christian capital. She is not portrayed as a soldier or ruler, but her intelligence, grievance, and ability to manipulate events make her powerful enough to change history. Power through strategy, not status. In a patriarchal world where women usually lack formal political or military authority, Ajoba's power comes through deception, persuasion, revenge, and social influence. The legend suggests that even excluded women can affect kingdoms from the margins. Female suffering turned into agency. The story implies that Ajoba's destructive action grows out of being wronged or humiliated. Her pain becomes a force that can overturn a city, making her both victim and avenger. Misogyny in the legend. At the same time, the tale reflects a misogynistic pattern. When a civilization falls, blame is placed on a woman. Ajoba becomes the explanation for Soba's destruction, turning a complex historical collapse into a warning about female vengeance and betrayal. Woman as temptress or traitor. The legend uses Ajoba as a figure of dangerous femininity, clever, resentful, and capable of destroying men and cities. This reinforces the idea that women's power is suspect when it is not controlled by male authority. Why the author refers to it. The author uses Ajoba to connect Sudan's past to the novel's recurring themes: lost Christian civilization, betrayal, the fall of old social orders, and the uneasy place of women in history. Ajoba symbolizes how women can be remembered as powerful only when that power is cast as catastrophic. Overall, Ajoba's tale is significant because it shows a double message. Women may possess immense agency, but patriarchal storytelling often interprets that agency as a threat, turning female power into a cautionary tale about disorder, revenge, and ruin. The story of Ajoba symbolizes the novel's idea that women can possess immense historical power even in societies that deny them formal authority. Her legend turns a wronged woman into the force behind the destruction of Soba, so she represents female agency, revenge, memory, and the ability of the marginalized to reshape history from the outside. At the same time, Ajoba also symbolizes misogynistic storytelling. The fall of a whole Christian city is explained through the actions of one woman, which reflects a patriarchal pattern of blaming women for social collapse, betrayal, and disorder. In that sense, Ajoba is made powerful, but her power is framed as dangerous and catastrophic. Within the novel, she also works as a bridge between Sudan's Christian past and its later Islamic present. Soba becomes a symbol of a lost Christian civilization, and Ajoba's story helps the author connect ancient Sudanese history with the themes Samir and Samira encounter later: religious change, betrayal, women's suffering, and the collapse of older social orders. Overall, Ajoba is symbolic because she is both a figure of female power and a scapegoat for historical ruin. The novel uses her to show how women's agency can be remembered, feared, and distorted by patriarchal culture. In the novel, Shahzad's child marriage to the elderly Haj Harun deeply disturbs Samir and Samira because it confirms many of the abuses they came to Sudan to document. It shocks them as evidence of child marriage. Shahzad's marriage shows them that a young girl can be transferred from her father's authority to an old husband's control, with little regard for her age, consent, or well-being. It strengthens their view of girls as treated like property. To Samir and Samira, the marriage reveals how daughters can be used to settle family, religious, or social arrangements rather than protected as children. It exposes the power of Sharia court authority, because the dispute involves the butcher, divorce rules, and Haj Harun's role. The couple sees how private family life is controlled by religious courts and legal procedures that prioritize male rights and formal rules over women's dignity. It horrifies Samira personally, as a woman and as someone with her own history of child marriage and exploitation. Samira reacts strongly to Shahzad's situation. It reopens her awareness of how vulnerable girls are when adults justify marriage through religion, custom, or family honor. It gives Samir more evidence for their book. Samir treats the episode as another important case study in their Sudan research, linking it to the broader themes of polygamy, divorce, wife obedience, child marriage, and women's lack of agency. It makes Sudan feel even more dangerous and morally urgent. The marriage reinforces their belief that Sudan is the clearest place to document the hidden suffering of women and girls, even though witnessing these events becomes emotionally exhausting. Overall, Shahzad's marriage to Haj Harun affects Samir and Samira by turning child marriage from an abstract issue into a direct social reality before their eyes. It deepens their outrage, strengthens their research mission, and makes Samira especially feel the personal and emotional weight of girls being sacrificed to adult male authority. The Sudan visit strongly shapes Samir and Samira's research conclusions because it gives them the direct domestic access they failed to find in earlier countries. Sudan confirms their original research focus. After Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Dubai, and Lebanon produced fragmented or public-facing evidence, Sudan allows them to observe women's lives inside homes, compounds, marriages, widowhood, and female-only spaces. They conclude that abuse is embedded in daily family structure through Sakina, Sulwa, the rival wives, and the butcher's household. They see that women's suffering is not only caused by public laws, but by ordinary domestic customs, gender segregation, obedience expectations, polygamy, divorce rules, widowhood, and economic dependence. Polygamy becomes a central case study. The butcher's 3 wives and 21 children lead them to conclude that polygamy creates rivalry, insecurity, jealousy, child neglect, wife beating, and emotional deprivation rather than stable family life. FGM becomes their strongest evidence of bodily control. Samira's first-hand witnessing of a 4-year-old girl's circumcision turns FGM from a topic they had heard about into direct evidence of harm justified through religion, honor, marriageability, and female enforcement of tradition. Child marriage appears as part of a wider loss of childhood. The Sudan section leads them to connect child marriage with child labor, child soldiering, poverty, and the idea that children, especially girls, are treated as family property rather than as individuals with protected rights. The Sharia court episodes deepen their legal critique. Disputes involving divorce, obedience, remarriage, and Haj Harun show them how religious court authority can control women's bodies, marriage status, and sexual access while minimizing female agency. Jihad culture expands their findings beyond women's issues. Khalid's Marriage of the Martyr helps them conclude that war ideology affects households directly. It glorifies male death while leaving women with poverty, widowhood, and insecurity. They see women as both victims and enforcers. Sudan changes their understanding because mothers, widows, neighbors, and midwives help maintain practices such as FGM, obedience, and marital conformity, often believing they are protecting honor or survival. Their final conclusion becomes broader and harsher. Sudan convinces them that women's suffering is sustained by an overlapping system of religion, custom, poverty, patriarchy, war, family honor, and female social pressure. Overall, Sudan becomes the couple's most important research site because it transforms their project from scattered observations into a structured conclusion. Oppression is not isolated or occasional, but built into household life, marriage customs, legal authority, and social expectations. Muslim men and women's roles in enforcing harmful social customs such as FGM and child marriage. In the Sudan section of the novel, harmful customs such as FGM and child marriage are shown as being enforced by both men and women, but in different ways. Men provide the authority structure. Fathers, husbands, religious leaders, and Sharia courts are portrayed as holding legal and religious power over girls' and women's bodies, marriages, sexuality, and obedience. Fathers control child marriage decisions. A girl's father or male guardian can give her in marriage at a very young age, treating her future as a family decision rather than her own choice. Older men benefit from the system. Figures like Hajj Harun represent how elderly or powerful men can gain access to young brides through social, religious, or court-approved arrangements. Religious law legitimizes male control. The novel presents Sharia court rulings as giving formal authority to male-centered practices around divorce, remarriage, wife obedience, and sexual access. Women enforce FGM inside the domestic sphere. Mothers, widows, neighbors, and traditional midwives are the ones who physically organize and carry out circumcision ceremonies. Mothers defend FGM as protection. The mother of the 4-year-old girl insists the procedure preserves honor, virginity, and future marriage prospects, showing how women may enforce harm because they believe it protects daughters socially. Female elders and neighbors normalize the practice. Sakina and Sulwa help restrain the child during the circumcision, making FGM a collective female ritual rather than an isolated act. The midwife holds inherited female authority. The circumciser has no medical training, but she is socially trusted because her role has been passed down through generations of women. Women police respectability. The fear of being called uncircumcised, dishonorable, unmarriageable, or sexually uncontrolled pressures mothers to impose FGM on daughters. Women also reinforce child marriage values. In polygamous households, a daughter's beauty, virginity, circumcision, and marriageability can raise her mother's status, so women may participate in preparing girls for early marriage. Overall, the novel portrays men as creating and benefiting from the legal, religious, and marital system, while women often enforce the customs within the household because survival, honor, marriage prospects, and social acceptance depend on obedience to that system. The religious arguments for polygamy are presented mainly as justifications used by Muslim characters and authorities. Quranic permission. The central argument is that the Quran allows a Muslim man to marry up to 4 wives, usually linked to Surah Al-Nisa 4:3. Male sexual and social rights. Polygamy is framed as a divinely permitted right for men, while women are not given an equivalent right to multiple husbands. Fair treatment requirement. The religious rule says a husband should divide time, sex, love, and maintenance fairly among his wives, though the novel argues this is nearly impossible in practice. Female obedience. Wives are expected to accept the husband's additional marriages because the practice is treated as authorized by God and therefore not open to objection. Protection and provision argument. Polygamy is sometimes defended as a way for men to provide for women, widows, or girls who might otherwise lack protection, though the novel portrays the result as rivalry and suffering. Prophetic precedent and Islamic tradition. The practice is also justified by reference to the Prophet Muhammad's marriages and the long-standing acceptance of polygamy in Islamic societies. Overall, the novel presents polygamy's religious justification as a combination of Quranic permission, male authority, claims of fairness, and social protection, but it criticizes the practice as producing jealousy, insecurity, wife rivalry, child neglect, and emotional harm. In the novel, the religious arguments for FGM/female circumcision are presented as justifications used by characters and community members, especially in the Sudan section. Hadith-based justification. The mother cites reports attributed to Muhammad, especially the story of Amatiyah, where a woman who circumcises girls is told not to overdo it. In the novel, this is treated as evidence that the practice is permitted rather than forbidden. Two circumcised parts, argument. Another cited hadith refers to sexual intercourse as the meeting of the two circumcised parts, which characters interpret as proof that both male and female circumcision were recognized. Honor preservation argument. The strongest religious justification is the hadith saying circumcision is a sunnah for men and a preservation of honor for women. The mother uses this to argue that FGM protects a girl's chastity, virginity, and future marriageability. Control of premarital sexuality. Characters argue that circumcision prevents girls from sexual desire, masturbation, or premarital sex, making it a religious safeguard for family honor. Marriageability and social acceptance. FGM is presented as necessary for a girl to be considered respectable, pure, and suitable for marriage in Muslim society. Community obligation. The practice is treated not merely as a family choice, but as a religious and social duty enforced by mothers, widows, neighbors, and traditional midwives. Overall, the novel portrays these religious arguments as tools used to make FGM appear divinely sanctioned, even though Samira sees the practice as brutal, harmful, and aimed at controlling girls' bodies and sexuality. In the novel, religious arguments for child marriage are presented as justifications used by characters, clerics, and Sharia-based authorities, not as neutral or endorsed interpretations. Prophetic precedent. The main argument is the example of Aisha, whom the text says was married to Muhammad as a young girl and whose marriage was later consummated when she was still underage. Characters use this as the strongest precedent for marrying young girls. Sharia permission. Clerics and courts are portrayed as saying that Islamic law permits the marriage of underage girls, especially when a father or male guardian gives consent. Guardian authority. The father's right over his daughter is treated as decisive. A girl's consent, maturity, or wishes are secondary to the authority of the male guardian. Marriage as halal, protection. Child marriage is justified as a lawful way to control sexuality, preserve virginity, and prevent premarital relationships. Family honor. Early marriage is connected to protecting the family's reputation, especially by ensuring that a girl remains sexually pure before being transferred to a husband. Economic and social protection. Some characters frame child marriage as a way to provide girls with protection, housing, and social legitimacy, especially in poor or unstable societies. Normalization through tradition. Because the practice is presented as long-standing and religiously sanctioned, families treat it as normal rather than abusive. Overall, the novel portrays religious arguments for child marriage as rooted in prophetic example, Sharia authority, fatherly guardianship, family honor, and fear of female sexuality, while criticizing the practice as harmful to girls' childhood. Consent, education, safety, and bodily autonomy. Religious arguments for wife's obedience. The religious arguments for a wife's obedience are presented as claims used by Muslim characters and authorities to justify male authority in marriage. Male guardianship. The main argument is based on Quran 434, which the novel says is used to teach that men are in charge of women because men provide financially and hold authority over the household. Obedience as religious duty. A wife's submission to her husband is framed not only as a marital expectation, but as part of her duty to God. Punishment of disobedience. The same verse is presented as justification for disciplining a rebellious or disobedient wife, including admonishing her, separating from her in bed, and striking/beating her. Sexual availability. The novel also cites hadiths saying that a wife should respond when her husband calls her for intimacy, even if she is busy, implying that refusal is treated as sinful disobedience. Husband's superior rights. Other hadiths in the document compare a husband's rights over his wife to an authority so great that, if prostration before a human were allowed, a wife would be ordered to prostrate before her husband. Shame and social control. Religious obedience merges with social pressure. A woman who resists her husband risks being labeled rebellious, dishonorable, or a source of family shame. Legal reinforcement. In the Sudan section, Sharia courts and local customs are portrayed as giving formal support to this obedience system, especially in disputes involving marriage, divorce, wife discipline, and reconciliation. Overall, the novel portrays the religious argument for wife's obedience as a system built on male guardianship, sexual duty, punishment for rebellion, and court-backed patriarchal authority. Examples of wife disobedience in the novel include: Malaika resists full veiling. After the staged conversion, the imam's wife wants her to cover her face completely, but Malik refuses the burqa/niqab demand, and Malaika only adopts the abaya and hijab. Malaika refuses female circumcision. When the imam recommends circumcision for both converts, Malaika rejects genital cutting and chooses to remain as she is. Malaika tests the limits of good Muslim wife rules. She is instructed not to wear Western clothes, perfume, or travel without a male guardian. Her discomfort with these rules shows her inner resistance to the obedience model. The Sudanese divorcee refuses to return to Dubai. After immigrating to Canada, she disobeys her abusive husband by refusing to go back with him, using Western legal protection to escape his control. The butchers' wives quarrel and challenge one another. Their fights, insults, and retaliation are treated as domestic disorder that could be punished if reported to their husband. The butchers' wives avoid bringing disputes to him. Their silence is strategic rather than obedient. They know involving him could lead to beatings or sexual neglect. Sulwa's constrained independence. As a widow, Sulwa does not openly rebel, but her situation illustrates how women are expected to remain modest, dependent, and controlled to avoid being labeled socially improper. Samira refuses to help restrain the child during FGM. When asked to assist in the circumcision, she refuses, directly rejecting the women's expectation that she participate in the custom. Samira's overall undercover resistance. Though she performs Muslim identity outwardly, she repeatedly questions, documents, and internally rejects the rules imposed on women. Overall, disobedience in the novel usually means a woman refusing, questioning, escaping, or quietly resisting male authority, religious rules, or community expectations around dress, sexuality, marriage, divorce, and bodily control. The consequences of wife disobedience are portrayed as severe because obedience is tied to marriage, honor, religion, and legal authority. Physical punishment. A husband may beat a wife who is seen as rebellious or disobedient, especially in the Sudan section where the butchers' wives fear involving him in their disputes. Sexual rejection or neglect. The butchers' wives avoid taking quarrels to him because they know he may punish them by refusing intimacy or withholding affection. Loss of status in the household. A disobedient wife risks being treated as troublesome, immoral, or unworthy compared with rival wives who appear more submissive. Divorce or abandonment. Since husbands are portrayed as having broad power to divorce, a wife who resists may lose marriage protection, financial support, and social legitimacy. Public shame. Disobedience can become a family scandal. A woman may be blamed for dishonoring her husband, father, or household. Economic vulnerability. If a wife is divorced, deserted, or forced out, she may have few acceptable ways to support herself, especially in societies where women's work outside the home is restricted or stigmatized. Social exposure and harassment. Widows, divorced women, and women outside male protection are portrayed as vulnerable to gossip, harassment, exploitation, or being treated as sexually available. Legal/religious pressure. Sharia courts and religious authorities are shown as reinforcing the husband's authority, especially in disputes involving obedience, divorce, remarriage, and reconciliation. Family pressure to endure abuse. In the Dubai-related divorcee's story, her father tells her to tolerate her husband's neglect and beating rather than bring shame on the family through divorce. Overall, wife disobedience in the novel is presented as a dangerous act because it can bring beating, neglect, divorce, shame, poverty, and social vulnerability, while the surrounding culture pressures women to submit for survival. The disobedient Muslim wives face social consequences that go beyond private marital conflict. Public shame. A wife who resists her husband risks being labeled rebellious, immoral, or dishonorable. Family disgrace. Her behavior can be seen as bringing shame not only on herself, but also on her father, husband, children, and wider household. Loss of protection. If she is divorced, abandoned, or sent away, she may lose the male protection that society expects women to depend on. Reduced marriage prospects. A woman known as difficult, divorced, or sexually used may be treated as less desirable and may only be considered for remarriage by older men or polygamists. Economic dependence. Because women's work outside the home is portrayed as shameful or unsafe, a disobedient wife may become financially vulnerable if her husband withdraws support. Social exposure. Without a husband's protection, she may become vulnerable to gossip, harassment, exploitation, or being treated as sexually available. Pressure to endure abuse. Families may tell women to tolerate beating, neglect, or mistreatment rather than risk divorce or scandal. Rival wife hostility. In polygamous households, a wife who challenges the husband or causes conflict can lose status against other wives who appear more submissive. Legal and religious pressure. The wider culture, including Sharia-based authority, is portrayed as reinforcing the husband's right to discipline or control a wife. Overall, the novel presents wife disobedience as socially dangerous because it can lead to shame, isolation, poverty, divorce, harassment, and loss of dignity. The custom around the first wedding night is presented through the couple's reaction to how a newly married bride is expected to be opened after FGM. Samira is horrified by what the custom means for the bride. After witnessing FGM, she realizes that a girl's body may be sealed so tightly that intercourse on the wedding night becomes painful, traumatic, and physically dangerous. Samir and Samira see the wedding night as another form of violence. Instead of a loving beginning to marriage, the custom is portrayed as forcing the groom to break through the effects of childhood circumcision, sometimes with injury, bleeding, or medical emergency. They connect it directly to FGM. The couple understands that the first-night trauma is not accidental. It is the intended result of a system designed to preserve virginity and prove family honor. Samira reacts personally and emotionally. As a woman and a former child bride herself, she is especially shaken by the idea that a young bride's first sexual experience could resemble assault rather than mutual intimacy. Samir treats it as research evidence. He records Samira's observations as part of their broader documentation of how Sudanese customs control women's bodies from childhood through marriage. Overall, the custom convinces them that FGM does not end with childhood cutting. Its consequences continue into marriage, turning the wedding night into a public test of virginity, a private ordeal for the bride, and another example of how honor is placed above women's pain and dignity. The wedding night custom severely affects the bride because it turns marriage into a continuation of the harm caused by FGM. Pain and fear replace intimacy. Because the bride has often been tightly circumcised or sealed, The first sexual encounter is described as painful, frightening, and physically traumatic rather than loving. The groom is expected to open her. The custom assumes the husband must force intercourse through the scarred or narrowed opening, which makes the bride's body a site of violence and proof rather than mutual affection. Virginity becomes a public family concern. The bride's pain and bleeding are treated as evidence of honor, chastity, and proper upbringing, so her suffering becomes socially valued. Medical danger is normalized. The narrative suggests that the bride may suffer tearing, heavy bleeding, infection, or need emergency medical help, yet the custom is treated as part of marriage. The bride has little agency. She is expected to submit because the wedding night is framed as the husband's right and the completion of the marriage. FGM's harm continues into adulthood. The custom shows that FGM does not end after childhood. It shapes the bride's sexuality, marriage, body, and emotional life for years afterward. Overall, the wedding night custom is portrayed as transforming a young bride's first marital experience into fear, pain, humiliation, and bodily violation in the name of virginity and family honor. Why the bride must resist the sexual advance of her groom in their first wedding night. The bride is expected to resist her groom on the first wedding night because resistance is treated as a public sign of modesty, virginity, and family honor. Resistance proves she is pure. If the bride appears reluctant, frightened, or physically resistant, the community interprets this as evidence that she has not had sexual experience before marriage. Submission would look suspicious. If she willingly accepts the groom's advances, people may assume she is sexually experienced, which could shame her and her family. It reinforces the idea that female desire is dangerous. The custom expects a good bride to show fear or refusal because open desire would be seen as immoral. It connects to FGM, since the novel links Sudanese wedding night customs to female genital mutilation. The bride's resistance is also tied to the painful process of being opened after childhood circumcision. The bride's body becomes proof of honor. Her pain, bleeding, and resistance are treated as signs that her family preserved her virginity properly. Overall, the custom forces the bride to perform innocence and endure pain so that her husband, family, and community can confirm her chastity and protect social reputation. The bride is expected to act modest, fearful, and resistant because open willingness would be seen as shameful or sexually suspicious. Her resistance is treated as proof of virginity, chastity, and proper upbringing. The family's honor is tied to the bride's body, so pain, bleeding, and reluctance become socially interpreted as signs that she was preserved for marriage. The groom is expected to assert his marital right, while the bride is expected to submit only after resistance, making the night a test of obedience and purity rather than mutual intimacy. The custom is linked to FGM because the bride may have been physically narrowed or sealed, turning the wedding night into a painful ordeal of being opened. Overall, the wedding night expectation forces the bride to perform innocence, protect family honor, and endure physical and emotional suffering as part of becoming a wife. The groom's role on the wedding night is presented as part of a custom that turns marriage into a test of the bride's chastity and obedience. He is expected to claim his marital right. The groom is treated as having the right to consummate the marriage, even if the bride is frightened or resistant. He must open the bride, because the bride may have undergone FGM and been tightly sealed. The groom is expected to force intercourse through the narrowed opening. He becomes the proof maker of virginity. The bride's pain, bleeding, and resistance are interpreted as signs that she was a virgin and that her family preserved her honor. His success confirms the marriage socially. Consummation is not only private intimacy, it becomes a social confirmation that the marriage is complete and the bride was properly guarded. He may use force or tools if penetration is impossible. The novel describes this custom as sometimes leading to injury, emergency medical treatment, or the groom using a knife or scissors to widen the bride. Overall, the groom's role is portrayed as enforcing a patriarchal custom. He completes the marriage by physically overcoming the bride's resistance and the effects of FGM, while the bride's suffering becomes evidence of honor rather than a matter of personal dignity. The bride's role on the first wedding night is to perform modesty, resistance, and submission at the same time. She is expected to appear fearful, reluctant, and resistant, because this resistance is treated as proof that she is innocent, modest, and sexually inexperienced. Her body becomes a test of family honor. Pain, bleeding, and difficulty are interpreted as evidence that she was a virgin and that her family protected her before marriage. If she appears too willing, she risks being judged as sexually experienced or dishonorable, so she must act as though she is resisting even though the marriage expects her eventual submission. Because the custom is linked to FGM, the bride's first sexual experience is described as physically painful and emotionally terrifying, especially if she has been tightly sealed or scarred. Emotionally, the bride is portrayed as feeling fear, shame, helplessness, pain, and humiliation, rather than affection or mutual intimacy. Overall, the wedding night turns the bride from a partner in marriage into a symbol of chastity and obedience, making her suffering serve the honor of her husband, family, and community.